Ladies, you should stop working out and eating like the guys. Women are often given terrible male-centric advice on how they should be exercising and dieting, throwing their hormones out of whack, making weight loss impossible, and sabotaging their health.
You're not broken. Yes, we are changing. The brain is restructuring. The hormones are changing. And your body has a default to want to express abundance and health.
So, how should ladies be doing it? And guys, what's the best way for you to support the women in your life? Dr. Stephanie Estima is here with a full guide which includes syncing everything to your cycle.
Your menstrual cycle basically is a report card that you get every month from your body. It tells you how healthy you are. It tells you based on the flow and the quality and the color and all the things that your period will tell you what you are doing right and where you can improve.
Unlike many experts who adapt general advice for women, Stephanie offers personalized strategies uniquely designed to work with your biology, not against it.
There are some people that say you should never train in the second half of the cycle. So I'm just going to call BS on that right now. You should train all through the cycle, but the way that you train is going to complement the hormonal landscape that you are currently marinating in.
For a hormone balance plan to finally get in shape and feel great, keep listening.
If a woman is listening and she's like, listen, I have terrible periods, or I'm in perimenopause, or I have, 10 extra, 20 extra, 40, 100 extra pounds that I don't want. I don't know where to start. The number one thing is just...
Welcome to the Health Optimization Podcast. I'm Tim Gray, the UK's leading biohacker. This podcast is all about gaining actionable advice from the world's top experts and sharing new breakthroughs in nature, biohacking, technology, longevity research to help you live longer and happier. Women are so often shortchanged when it comes to fitness. Menstrual cycles and hormonal fluctuations play a huge role in how women respond to training. And yet they're often given watered down versions of what men are doing in the gym. And that approach is all wrong. Female strength needs to be celebrated and understood differently. That's why I brought on Dr. Stephanie Estima, aka the Geeky Goddess. She doesn't just adapt male-centric fitness routines for women. She tailors health strategies based on the unique phases of the female hormonal cycle. This precise bio-individual approach ensures women are optimizing their workouts and nutrition for better results, longevity, and hormonal balance. This conversation isn't just for women. Men, if you have any women you love in your life, keep listening so you know how to support them throughout the month. Dr. Stephanie Estima, welcome to the show.
I am just delighted to be here, Tim. Thank you for having me.
I'm looking forward to this. This is going to be a fun episode.
Yes, for the women and the men who love them.
Yes, yeah. That's right. Yeah. I did a post around female cycle a few months ago now, and bearing in mind about 40% of my followers are female, 40% are male, sorry. It's like, how do I get the men to engage with the female content? Like, why would they care? And in fact, well, actually, since I've learned the female cycle and this era of health, it's been fantastic for the women in my life, especially in my relationship with Simona. When you're going through tough times, when you can push her a little bit harder to get, for her Pilates or whatever. And it's just like, actually, it gives you so much more awareness of what someone's going through in the month. So I'm really looking forward to finding out and digging in deep today.
Yeah, I think you bring up, even before we get into a lot of the details, a really important point around when we're talking about female cycles, the ebbs and flows, the hormonal landscape, how that changes over the month, and then, even a broader view in terms of how that changes over the course of a year. This is, or many years or decades. This is not just for, first of all, women do need to understand their own cycles, but it's for the environment in which that woman lives with her partner, teaching her sons, or, it's for the entire community, because for a long enough time, I think that women were just, looked at as sort of smaller men, right? So it's like little men with these pesky hormones, as we were talking about in the pre-chat. And I think that we're coming into this era where talking about the menstrual cycle in an open, non-goofy kind of way, in terms of, these are some of the hormonal and physiological and metabolic changes that happen for a woman. It allows her to be supported by her community, the women and the men who love her and support her, and it allows her to flourish. So I know that we haven't got into quite the, the mechanics of everything yet, but I think that that's a really important point that you started off with. Yeah.
Yeah. To supplement that, I would say that if your partner man or woman has not slept very well, or they've been traveling for work and they're knackered, you give them a break. You do, because you know straight away that they're having a tough time because they're knackered.
Right.
Well, I pose to the guys listening to this, well, how about you understand the female cycle of when they're having a tough day because they are knackered, because their hormones fluctuate throughout the month, unlike us men. So a couple of months ago, I was getting some grief, and I was just like, in my head, I was like, what is going on? Why am I getting a tough time from Simona right now? I just can't understand it. And I was thinking, have I done something? Is this me? Like, how can I be better? And I was like, well, actually, I think the timing is this. And I'm like, oh. And instead of just responding with something defending myself, I just replied, I love you. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. And she replied, thank you. Thank you so much. And then a few days later, when, you know, the tougher time had passed, she was like, I really appreciated how you had that. And I was like, thank you for knowing the cycle, female cycle, because I could not have been that man without that understanding. So just to, I guess, emphasize the point even more, how important it is for both men and women to understand the cycle. And also for my partner, understanding the cycle of what she's going through throughout the month has helped her learn more about what's happening to her body through the month, which is what I hope everyone can
how
get.
that affects her mental state, her irritation level, her inflammatory response, all of those things are super important. Yeah.
And that will help every female listening to this podcast to understand themselves a little bit more if they didn't already.
Yeah. Beautifully said. And we love Simona. Shout out to her.
She's going to be glowing right now. So how does your approach differ from other female health specialists, would you say?
I think that the way that I look at the arc of a woman's life, there's several different, we'll call it phases. What we started talking about is sort of what happens to her in her fertile years. And then there's a consideration for how she progresses through those fertile years every single day, every single week. What are some of the hormonal hiccups that she might come across? And then I also talk about how those things change into perimenopause and menopause. And I don't know if we'll have time to talk about that today, but I would love it if we could either today or another time. So I think in terms of, you know, what makes me different, let's say, is that we do consider when we're talking about how a woman might feel, how she might look, what her emotional landscape might be, what her motor coordination and her neurological landscape might look like. It's always done with the lens of what is happening in terms of where her menstrual cycle is, where she is in that sort of arc of life. Is she in her fertile years? Perimenopausal, of course, there's some changes that happen in that fourth decade of life, moving through to menopause, and then, of course, the postmenopausal transition. So what I like to do is look at some of the levers that she can become a master in. So we look at nutrition and some of the nutritional levers that we can pull. And of course, that changes over the course of the month and in perimenopause. Fitness, of course, stating my bias, big fan of resistance training, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. But how we can think about optimizing a movement pattern that works for us over the long term, that we enjoy and that we love. And then the third piece would be stress management, which, if I'm being honest, I think, you know, just the term stress management, I think has a marketing problem, because everyone's like, yeah, I get it. I got to manage my stress. But I think if we look at stress management in the same way that we look at nutrition and the same way that we look at fitness, insofar as it's something that I have to do every single day. Like, we don't have a green smoothie and be like, I've reached nutrition, I've reached, I've reached my peak. Same with fitness. We don't go to the gym, do a couple of squats and say, there we go. I'm fit. I don't ever have to do this again. So the same is true with stress management. I think we have to be thinking about every single day, what are the things that are good stressors for me? What are some of the things that are stressing me out in a chronic negative way? And then how can I infuse more of what I love to do to balance out that distress, right? So there's good stress, bad stress. There's a quote that I love that I've been talking about a lot recently on my own show, which is, it's not that you're too stressed out. It's that you're not doing enough of the things that bring you joy and happiness. So there's an imbalance in the ether, so to speak. So those are sort of the three levers that I like to talk about from a lifestyle perspective. And then, when you talk about perimenopause and menopause, the hormonal conversation also, or hormone replacement therapy, I should say more accurately, comes into play as well.
Which can be game changing.
Yeah.
Really game changing.
Absolutely can. Yeah.
So you hit rock bottom at 38 with your health. How did that help shape your methodology in your work today?
Well, I actually talked about this at Health Optimization Summit when I had the privilege of speaking to your audience in London. I had sort of everything come at me at the same time. So I had a clinic, very, vibrant, robust, bustling clinic, burned down to the ground. I was going through a divorce at that same time. I had young children. Anybody that's ever been through a breakup of any kind knows how difficult and emotionally chaotic that can feel. And so in terms of, that was my life experience. As you might imagine, I spoke about this at HOS, that my menstrual cycles were completely, they were just a gong show. It felt like my body was angry at me. Everything felt angry, inflamed, puffy, couldn't sleep, mood and affect. I had trouble concentrating on, I was forgetting like my patients' names and the issues that they were having. It was a mess. So in terms of how that shaped my thinking around women's health, there was a couple of things that happened in sequence. So one, I went on vacation. I was able to relax. I was able to get daily sunshine, walking in Europe, good food, the salty sea, all of that, able to just bring my nervous system down a little bit. And then recognizing that, okay, Italy, it was Italy where we went. I said, maybe everything's just better in Italy, but it was still my body that was able to bring about those changes. So it was my body in North America that was struggling, and then my body in Europe that was thriving. So is it the location? Maybe. But my body still had the capacity to bring about those changes. So could I come back now to Toronto, which is where my current home is, and still maintain some of the lessons that I had brought back from that vacation? So I started making sure I was getting daily walks and daily morning light, and making sure that I was exercising, and starting to put together some of the pieces with my patients, because in the practice we were running nutrition programs, we were running fitness programs, and I was already seeing that the women were struggling more than the men. And it was very much amplified when it was a husband and wife couple, because now you can control for the environment. They're living in the same home, they're eating the same foods, but the males, like the men on the programs, were getting much better results than the women were. So I always say I'm very grateful to those patients sort of in those early days, because I was essentially experiment, what they always say, a practice. The reason why we call it a practice is because it's not a perfect, right? We're practicing with our patients. So I'm very grateful to those patients who let me practice and sort of play around with this idea that I had, that maybe the way that where they were in their cycle, or the types of food that they were eating, would change over the course of the menstrual cycle, let's say. So it was a little bit of my own my own personal experience with struggling with my menstrual cycle for so long, and having these catastrophic events sort of crash. I felt like I was crashing and burning at the same time, and coupling that with coming back refreshed from a vacation and able to sort of see things with clearer sight and start to play around with my patients. And, like I said, I'm so thankful to them for allowing me to just play a little bit and tweak their program, because that essentially became the body of work that I then went on to publish in the Betty Body, which was how to eat for your cycle, how to train for your cycle, how your stress and your emotional landscape might change over the course of your menstrual cycle as well.
So what do you know now that you wish you knew back then that could have sped up your recovery or improvement?
What's coming to me as you're asking that question is sometimes you just have to take imperfect action. So for all of the achievement-oriented type A personality individuals who are listening right now, they're like, no, it has to be perfect before I do something. I'm not ready. I'm going to wait. For me, I was exactly that as well. So I didn't want to start a fitness program until I knew exactly what I was doing. I didn't want to start a nutrition program until I had all the ingredients in my fridge and everything was all measured and I knew. So I would say the number one thing is just take imperfect action. You're going to fail. Things are going to mess up and you're just going to have to recalibrate, but you're never going to, in the same way that if you've ever listened to your first podcast episode, it's painful, right? My first podcast episode 5 years or so now ago, it's very difficult for me to listen to that, but I had to do that. I had to go through that in order to find my own voice, in order to find the way that I wanted to communicate with my community. In the same way, if a woman is listening and she's like, listen, I have terrible periods, or I'm in perimenopause, or I have, 10 extra, 20 extra, 40, 100 extra pounds that I don't want. I don't know where to start. Just start anywhere. Just do something. It doesn't matter if it's perfect. Over time, you'll be able to refine it so that it is perfect for you, but you'll never get there if you don't start. So that would be the advice I would probably give to my younger self, as well as anybody listening who does feel, I love this term, infobesity. So it's like we have so much information that we almost get into this freeze state. It's like, oh my God, I just listened to a podcast about, whatever, and I don't know what to do from it. And then here's 6 other podcasts that I'm going to listen to on the same subject, and then I still don't actually make any actual meaningful changes in my life. So the number one thing is just do something, anything. It doesn't matter if it's, a walk, you're just taking an extra lap around the block today. That's something. And it's the butterfly effect, right? It's like the butterfly changes direction. And then we have this cascade of events that causes the tornado, so to speak.
So you're a former figure/bikini contestant, and you've had to go beyond what most people would have to go beyond in terms of dieting and things.
Yeah.
Like what have you taken from this and how does this affect you today?
Couple things. One, there's a lot of body dysmorphia in the fitness industry. I'll just say that. I think that a lot of individuals feel, when you're getting ready to get on stage, you are very close to death. I'll just put it, you are dehydrated, you are undernourished. And of course the goal of getting on stage is to get as lean as you can and preserve as much muscle as you can. But that is not an ideal for women to strive to. And I know that there's bikini competitions and I know that there's Olympias and all of that, which is, if you're a competitor and you love to do that, I'm not poo-pooing on you, but I think the translation to women watching that is that should be the ideal body fat that I should strive to. And that is completely unhealthy. Speaking of menstrual cycles, about half, probably a bit more, of these competitors don't have a regular cycle. Okay. So the appearance of being that lean, maybe it has aesthetic benefits, right? Like, we can see the glutes and we can see the shoulders and we can see the abs and all the things, but women are not, all year round, we're not supposed to see your abs. Okay. So I'll say that. I mean, there's some women who have just maybe they're more androgenic in nature where they just always have their abs showing. They're just naturally very lean. But for 98% of the population, you should not have 6 abs. Like you shouldn't be able to see all of your abs, right? 6-pack abs. So that's the first thing I'll say, is just understanding that is not an ideal for health. If you don't have a menstrual cycle, your menstrual cycle basically is a report card that you get every month from your body. It tells you how healthy you are. It tells you, based on the flow and the quality and the color and all the things that your period will tell you, what you're doing right and where you can improve. So that's the first thing. The other thing that I do think that the fitness industry, particularly competitors, do relatively well is what I just mentioned before, is how can you get lean and jacked, right? So how can you preserve as much muscle as you can? And in their case, they're doing it in extreme caloric deficits. But if we translate that to a little bit of a gentler approach for the population, how do we preserve or add on to the amount of muscle that we have? And part of that is a nutritional component, of course, and there's a strategic component that happens in the gym. From a nutritional component, it's having somewhere around 30 to 40% of your calories coming from protein. You'll see this with bodybuilders. I think Chris Bumstead has said, by the end of it, like when he kind of gets down to getting on stage, he's basically just having like almost 100% protein. Like it's just like whey protein powders and water, because they're trying to cut out everything else. They're just trying to preserve as much muscle as they can. So I think that there's some lessons that we can take there is as we age, what are the strategies that can preserve our muscle? Not to get stage lean, but just to preserve the muscle that we have. And then I like to add on a caveat, preserve and if possible, add on the amount of lean muscle mass that we have, because I do think that that's important. So part of that is protein consumption. And of course, the other part of it, as I stated in my bias earlier, is resistance training. So these competitors, even in their I'll call it malnourished, undersatiated state, are still mechanically stimulating the muscles. They are still lifting weights, albeit not to the, maximum amount that they're able to, but they're still getting in the gym and sending the message to the body that this functional tissue, this muscle tissue needs to be preserved. So those are sort of the two big lessons. One, it's not an ideal. You can't be that body lean. You can't be that lean as a woman all the time. Even the bodybuilders, like, you've seen them after their competitions, they're eating pizza and burgers and cheese and whatever there is because they're so hungry. So that's not an ideal to strive for. And we can take some really good lessons in terms of how to preserve lean muscle mass from them.
It's super interesting because two things is I hear, quite a few people, as a biohacker with 60 to 70% female audience, I get a lot of questions. And unfortunately, I can't answer them all because I could spend my whole day answering them. But like so many people have said that they lost their period when they're stressed. And well, I mean, for various different things, actually. But a lot of them lose their period and they're like, why is that? Well, when the body's super stressed, and whether that's through an emotional time or whether it's through a physical, like overtraining, the body's not ready to make babies.
Correct.
And it's like you say, it's a monthly check-in card. I always think of it as in like, and the reason is because it's just not ready to make babies. And it's like if someone's having trouble getting pregnant, and let's assume it's not the man for a second, just because of the topic of today. If the man's sperm count and motility and everything is okay, but still not getting pregnant, it's like, well, is there some stress or something or other with the nervous system that needs to be calm? And I'll tell you why I actually looked into this. Is one of my best friends and our COO of the summit, Isabel. When I first met her at one of the London meetups, actually.
She's gorgeous, by the way.
She's an amazing human.
I love her.
She's an amazing human.
Yes. Your whole team is amazing.
I met her at the meetup, and she had great energy, and she seemed to know a bit about biohacking. And there was something about her I thought I'd like to work with her. And I looked at her Instagram, and she is bikini contest. And I looked at her, I was just like, this is a different woman. It's like she had, had the six pack. She was like just didn't look like anything like she was today. And she was miserable, it turns out. But what it taught me was that actually she had absolute dedication to the cause. And I knew what she would be like is in terms of her mental abilities to actually work with, which was, one of the things. And I said to her, I really would like to work with you. Let's be friends, and I'd like to hire you.
Yeah.
It showed me how dedicated she was to the cause, which I, knew would translate over to the summit, considering she was in the space. But at the same time, and when we later explored it and discussed it, and she said, yeah, I'd lost my period. I was super depressed. I'd never been in such a bad place before. And when I started eating properly and my body came out of the stress state, that's when I started flourishing again. And I got my period back, and life got better and better and better from the right nutrition and not stressing my body so much. Yeah. So it really, because obviously being, one of my 3 closest friends on the planet, today still, it really gave me the motivation to understand this a lot more. And in fact, it's because of, our friendship that we've evolved into being such a female oriented content within our content at the summit. So it's just, I just want to express for my friend how this is not just a rare occurrence. I think it's very common when people push themselves too hard, and that can be in the gym or in the workplace.
Absolutely. Yeah. Stress is, I always want to be careful because I think that a lot of times stress gets a bad rap. So we have eustress, like working out. So Isabel doing hip thrusts in the gym, which we've all seen. Well, if you haven't, you should check her out.
340 kilos.
She's incredibly impressive. I bow down to you, girl. So she is that's a eustress. That is a good type of stress where your body's going to level up and adapt to it, right? It's the chronic low-grade stress, being in a job that you hate, being in a relationship that is toxic to you in some capacity, unresolved trauma or maltreatment from childhood. These things that sort of leave this, as you said, this residue on the nervous system and our everyday functioning. That's the stuff that kills you, right? That's the stuff that makes you lose your period, that helps with, or, contributes to the infertility problem that you had described. And so it is really important for us to be thinking about, as women, optimizing our environment, optimizing our cycle. It's so important to be looking at your period every month and saying, all right, what came up for me this month? You were mentioning before you and your partner were having a bit of an exchange, and maybe she was, I'm going to guess she was probably late week 4 in the luteal phase of her cycle. And that time, often in the past, it was like, oh, she's, getting her period. Oh, PM, this sort of derogatory, like, oh, she must be that time of month. But that is a point in a woman's cycle where she's exquisitely sensitive to stress. She's already probably a little bit more inflamed because of the hormonal environment. You add in living in a city, and you're not, maybe you're not getting as much daylight or as much daily activity and all the things that can contribute to some of this poor health. So when you take all of these pieces of chronic low-grade stress and inflammation, and she's in the second half of her cycle, she might snap at you. She might not be sleeping well, right? And we know, as you said before, when someone comes home knackered from a job or stressed from a family situation, and she has these physical and or environmental factors that are contributing to her stress, and she's in the luteal phase of her cycle, we want to be able to know that information so that we can support her, right? Give her a day of rest. And the other thing I'll say, just for my action-oriented type A, I call you guys my boardroom Betties, because you're a boss in the boardroom, right? But sometimes you struggle in other areas of your life, is that resting is incredibly productive. So and I will say, in the spirit of transparency and honesty, that I also struggle with that, right? So it is very difficult for me just to do nothing. I'm always like, well, maybe I'll just reorganize, or maybe I'll just go for a walk, or maybe I'll just, it's very difficult for me to just sit and be still. So I recognize that may be a challenge for a woman who's listening, and maybe even men as well. But rest is incredibly productive. And so if you are feeling stressed, if you are feeling overwhelmed, I would invite you to think about what are some of the ways that you can reduce the pressure and the noise and the distress in your life, so that we're a little bit more even keel.
There's a saying I shared out on Instagram. I don't remember where I got it from, but it was, pick a day to relax or your body will pick it for you.
Oh gosh, that's good.
And it's like, there's so many people, including Dr. Dom, my friend Dom, he would be in the gym 7 days a week. And I'm like, dude, you do realize that you're holding yourself back by not having some recovery time, because you're always pushing. It's always pressure testing the system, opposed to saying pressure testing, repair. And I think he now works out 4 days. I think he said last time I saw him, instead of 7. But it's the type A, more, more in Liver King's terms. Yeah. But yeah, it's so true. Pick a day to relax, or your body will pick it for you. And I think I'd gone down. Actually, my problem was the opposite. I'd pushed myself so hard. I'd got ill. Then I'd used to relaxing and taking it easy. And then I was like, well, actually, any pushing on myself will actually make me more fatigued and tired. So therefore, I was scared to work out. I was scared to exercise too much, because I want to conserve this amazing energy I have.
So many women with Hashimoto's thyroiditis also have that very same experience, where they also want to go to they want to go to the gym and push it. So maybe it's slightly different, but the act of going to the gym is so tiring for them, and their recovery is so much greater. Their immune system needs are so much greater, that they get confused by whether or not the gym is a good idea for them. And I've talked about this a little bit. The type of woman who has a hard time, let's say, revving herself up to go to the gym in the way that you just described, or once she gets there, doesn't have the internal GPS to know when to back off. It's like, go, like Dr. Dom, like go 7 days. Like, I'm going to go like full tilt or nothing, often is a trauma response. There's some and I say this with love, there's somewhere in your story where someone told you that you weren't good enough, weren't smart enough, pretty enough, worthy enough, something not enough, where you are now constantly trying to prove, and your own internal system about when to back down, you're not listening to it anymore. So for those women that are how you just described, if you are someone who wants to go to the gym, my recommendation for those women, especially when they're first starting back out, is you're going to go at like 40%. 40, 50, maximally 60%, which is the absolute hardest thing to do for someone who's achievement oriented. If I say to you, go 50% of what you can, you're like, screw this lady. I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to go as hard as I want. And I'm going to show her that I am not human. It's like, well, my dear, welcome to the human race. You know, we're all, we all have finite limitations of our matter.
Yeah. I love the thought, and it actually keeps me going. It's in, like, for instance, when I hear, oh, I can't do it, I don't want to do it, the situation isn't right, I'm not going to go to the gym, whatever. It's like, they're just excuses. Make it happen, but also know when not to make it happen. And I think that's a delicate balance. And I think, I'm now in, and I push hard in the gym to the point where I'm collapsing on the floor when I am in, but I do that 2 to 3 times a week with a trainer.
Right. Where you have 3 to 4 times recovery.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I fuel properly through the days in between properly. And I think, it's hard enough. It's hard enough doing that without fluctuating hormones. So I can only imagine what it's like being a woman having fluctuations of hormones through the month, where things change, or it can be easier to work out and then harder to work out. And it's complex. It's a complex puzzle.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why isn't syncing your workouts with your cycle talked about more? And, is there skepticism around this, would you say?
Yeah, 100% there's skepticism. I think it's getting better now, but I think a lot of fitness is still driven by a lot of bro science, and, bros don't have periods, right? So they don't really necessarily, and I will say the one thing that I jokingly always say whenever I hear someone talking about, oh, the menstrual cycle doesn't affect, it's like, and they're usually men, it's like, you know what I love the most? When a man explains to me about how my period should be, how my cycle should go. It's the best. But I say that sarcastically, of course. But I think for the most part, there's a lot of men who dominate the space. And, there are many men that I love, respect, have been mentors to me, who've taught me a lot. And there needs to be more female voices around this, because I can tell you that I'm not just talking about an N of 1. I've had thousands of women say to me that they feel different over the course of their cycle, that they feel clumsier in the second half of their cycle. And we can actually explain this through activation, like some of these anabolic hormones, testosterone and estrogen, peak for a woman in the first half of her cycle, in the follicular phase, right? So we see testosterone rising, estrogen rising. Usually in week 2 is where we see them reach their sort of crescendo or their apex. And so a woman's motor coordination changes over the course of her cycle, right? So if you are starting a new movement pattern, it's not to say that you can't start a movement pattern in the second half of your cycle, but it would be better if you're starting a new program in bleed week or in week 2 of your cycle, because we see this elevation, let's say, of these anabolic hormones that impact our motor coordination. So we see motor coordination change over the cycle. I've had hundreds of women say they walk into a room in the second half of their cycle, don't know where their keys are, don't know where they've put their phones, sleep alterations, feeling more. For me, for years, I can sort of share personally, like I always had very, very tender, and I wrote about this in the book, I call them angry breasts, like my sports bras, everything just felt very tender. I felt very sensitive. So wearing some of these sports bras were very uncomfortable. So taking into account sleep altercations, mood and affect, motor coordination, not to mention that we see metabolic changes as well. So we've been talking a little bit about sex hormones, but we also see a metabolic change for a woman across the cycle. So she's more insulin sensitive, typically in the first phase, insulin insensitive in the second phase of the cycle, or I should say follicular and luteal phases of the cycle. So yes, there's skepticism. Why people don't talk about training through the site. I think that there are some people who talk about it, but I think that it can be a little overly prescriptive the way that because even though we're talking about women who menstruate, even within that cohort, there's going to be a lot of bio-individuality, right? So the way that I like to talk about training with the cycle is understanding that there's going to be bio-individuality. There's going to be times of the cycle when you're going to feel like you have more energy because you are producing more ATP, and that you can really push it. There's a lot of motor coordination that you can really go for, like a personal best, a PB or a PR, personal record. And then there's going to be times where you still want to maintain, you still want there to be a mechanical stimulus. Like you want to be training all through the cycle. There are some people that say you should never train in the second half of the cycle. So I'm just going to call BS on that right now. You should train all through the cycle. But the way that you train is going to complement the hormonal landscape that you are currently marinating in, right? So if you are feeling more inflamed, maybe what we can do is we can decrease the weight a little bit, increase the reps a little bit. So now you are actually, if you'll just permit me to go on a little geeky magic carpet ride here for a second. Every time we contract our muscles, we spill out into the bloodstream proteins and peptides. They're called myokines. They've been dubbed the molecules of hope, which I just love, that cross the blood-brain barrier, that are able to literally rewire certain areas of the brain, the hippocampus in particular, and the prefrontal cortex. So like I said, just indulge me in this little geek side note for a moment, but the prefrontal cortex is involved in future thinking, strategy. It's also involved in inhibiting lower brain centers, lower emotional brain centers. So the limbic system, where anger and sort of these emotional primitive outbursts can happen. So you strengthen the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, and then you also strengthen an area called the hippocampus. So these peptides and proteins, these myokines, can also positively impact the hippocampus, which is involved in learning and memory. And the other thing I'll say, if you'll permit me one more minute, is that the bones also release a hormone called osteocalcin. So it doesn't get as much, clout as, let's say, insulin, but it is a hormone, 10th most abundant hormone in the body. And it can help the body, the muscles, take up glucose in an insulin independent way. So it also helps with body composition, helps with with steroidogenesis, notably testosterone, and some of the neurotransmitters like dopamine and all that. So all that to say is the more that you contract your muscles, the more that you're spilling out these molecules of hope into the body and into the brain that help with mood and affect, which a woman might be subject to more emotional distress in the second half of her cycle. So maybe we want to be contracting the muscles more, maybe with a lighter load because she's not as coordinated, but we're contracting the muscles more. We get more myokines, we get more of that osteocalcin, which is helping with that body composition and testosterone synthesis. Yeah. So I know that's thank you for letting me nerd out with you for a moment, but I think it's important for women that happens all that process will happen all through the cycle. But you can really push a heavier weight in the first half of the cycle. And then when you're feeling more inflamed, you can still lift heavy. You can still move to muscle failure, which is the point. Whether you're lifting 5 reps or 30, the literature suggests that you'll still grow muscle in that rep range. So 5 reps or 30, you got a lot of choice in there. But if you're feeling more inflamed, maybe you want to bias your workouts to a higher rep range so that you're now also profiting from these brain boosting benefits and these glucose regulation benefits that osteocalcin can provide.
It really makes a lot of sense. But so in the last year, I've been testing testosterone replacement therapy just a little bit, just to see how my body adapts. And it's very interesting because it changed my drive and my focus. And I feel so much more present in the world. My levels weren't super low anyway. They were okay. But the point is by adding a little bit in really made me more precise and less clumsy. So as you were saying, depending on where someone is in their cycle, they become more clumsy. Yeah. I would imagine they've had the testosterone peak and it's starting to come down again in the second part of the cycle. So it's just really interesting as you're saying that. I'm like, it kind of really makes sense of how you can see the fluctuation of hormones from the more emotional stage with higher estrogen and one where there's more precise stage where there's higher testosterone. Yeah. So it's very, very interesting.
And the other thing that's really interesting as well, that you said you feel more focused, testosterone and dopamine also have a very close relationship with each other. So, and they have a bidirectional relationship. So as one goes up, the other one goes up. As one goes down, the other one goes down. So dopamine often, we call, it's like the pleasure-seeking hormone, but it's really involved in achievement, right? In chasing your dreams and your goals. So if your testosterone is higher, then your willingness or your inclination to be focused and to chase your dreams and to go after them is also going to be higher as well. And so interestingly, when we are resistance training, depending on how fit you are, let's say, you can actually have these transient increases in testosterone production from the osteocalcin release from the bones, and also just because of the mechanical stimulus in the muscle, such that, depending on how fit you are, we see anywhere from like 10 hours to 48 hour, a 10 hour to a 48 hour lift of testosterone after you train. So the fitter you are, the smaller the lift, because you've turned over you're much more fit, you're much more efficient. But if you're someone who's just starting resistance training, you can have like a 2-day elevation, like a 48 hour, up to 48 hour elevation in your levels of testosterone. So that's not only going to benefit your lean body mass and your ability to dispose of glucose and all the metabolic benefits in your libido, which also is a big thing for a lot of women, especially as they age. We often have one of the bigger complaints is lowered libido. So that it can help with that. And it can also help with your motivation and your cognitive ability and your focus. One of the biggest things that I hear in women in perimenopause as their cycle is changing is not only the complaints about the cycle changing, but I used to be this really confident woman. Like I used to be able, like my boardroom Betty, I used to be able to walk into and like own the meeting. And now I feel like I'm a former shell of myself. I have no libido. I can't make any decisions. I'm riddled with anxiety. And so testosterone is a really important piece to that. And it's a separate conversation. I love that you're experimenting with TRT. The other, I'll say, injustice that we see currently still today is that women are not afforded that same ability. The only reason why TRT, at least at the time of this recording, is justified is for HSDD, or hyposexual desire disorder. Which, great, if you have low libido and it's affecting your marriage, like certainly you can explore that. And a woman who's 40, who's complaining of low libido, or she's seeing a change in her body composition, or she's just subjectively saying, I don't feel like myself anymore. Maybe we want to look at TRT for her. Maybe it's unfair to say, oh, just suck it up, buttercup. This is just a part of aging. That's not right.
And we've advanced enough where we can supplement where needed, but to supplement. So I've actually got 2 questions now. So the first question is menopause, perimenopause. Do you want to explain the stages of where we go, when ladies hit that age, and what the different stages are called and what we can expect? So that's the first one. Second point would be, if you're looking at a monthly cycle starting day 1, what people should do throughout. So for instance, what day should they train, and which day should they load up on calories, and so on and so forth. Because I feel like, and I'm saying for the guys listening specifically, but also obviously for the ladies, but what should we expect? First of all in the stages, and then throughout the cycle?
Sure. Yeah. So maybe I'll start with the cycle first, and then I can explain a little bit better in terms of how that changes in perimenopause and menopause, if that's okay with you. So when we think about the menstrual cycle, there's a couple of different hallmarks. Day 1 of your cycle is the day that you start bleeding, right? So this is when we see blood in, whatever, if you're using a cup or tampon or whatever. That for most women, that's going to last anywhere from 3 to 7 days. As you get older, the length of your cycle tends to shorten. So if you started off, you were like, I bleed for 7 days, as you are navigating your 30s and especially through your 40s, we start to see the length of the week that you bleed. It also tends to shorten as well. In terms of what you might think about doing this week, when we're thinking about the levers that we were talking about before, nutrition and fitness and what have you, from a nutrition perspective, I do like there to be, and I talked about this at HOS, is blood building foods. So I'd like there to be, and I'm a meat eater. I like animal proteins, but you could totally do this with plant proteins as well. I'd like there to be foods that are rich in heme, rich in iron. So like dark meats, like red meats, lamb, goat, usually the darker, and if you're someone who has chicken, like the chicken thighs, right? So the darker the meat, usually the more iron or the more heme that you're gonna derive from it. So that would be a strategy, let's say, that you can think about when you are bleeding, because you are losing a lot of blood. And with that blood, like you have to think about, it's not just you're not just bleeding. This is the lining. This is the 5-star hotel that your body has been putting together for the reception of this potentially fertilized egg, right? So you have so many nutrients in there. You have glucose, you have amino acids, you have free fatty acids, you have selenium, you have magnesium, you have zinc, you have all of these different beautiful things that your body has sort of like padded, and you're losing that now in the blood. So I like animal products, as I mentioned. You can certainly, there's a lot of literature now that's sort of suggesting that you can also get there with plant proteins. You just need to do your due diligence. I'm not 100% convinced of that, but I am someone who's willing to change her mind. So it does seem that the literature is showing that, at least in terms of stimulating muscle tissue, as long as you sort of get enough of plant proteins, which are typically like poor in certain amino acids that drive the MPS process, that you can still do that with plants. So that would be a nutrition sort of trick, if you will, or an action item in week 1, is thinking about having blood building foods. In terms of fitness, a lot of women feel very crampy. There's a lot of prostaglandins, the uterus is contracting to expel the lining. So sometimes a walk is what you're going to do, right? Sometimes like day 1, day 2, it's walk, Pilates, something that's a bit gentle where you're still moving the joints. You're getting like nice, when you're walking, there's this beautiful sort of figure 8 that happens with the sacrum. So you're lubricating the joints. A lot of women feel a lot of pain in their low back as well when they're menstruating. So first 1 or 2 days, if you're crampy, you can take the day or 2 off. That's fine. And then when you're kind of in the flow of things, pun intended, you can kind of get back to the gym and lift. This is like in this first 2 weeks, this is when you can really start to be thinking about lifting heavier. So I detail a lot of this in the Betty Body, but in week 1, you might think about moderate rep ranges, something like an 8 to 12 rep set, kind of depending on how you're feeling. When we move into week 2, we were talking about this before, we see this apex, we see this apical rise in estrogen, this apical rise in testosterone, both anabolic hormones. Your brain, there's estrogen and testosterone receptors literally all over your body. Brain, lungs, heart, like everywhere, bones, breast tissue. So you can really push it in this week in the gym. So you should be feeling like you have a lot more energy. So this might be, depending on your sleep and your stress levels, you can certainly be pushing this to personal best in terms of lifting the heaviest weight that you can. In terms of food, I'm often asked a lot about fasting. I think for women who like to fast, you can, if you are someone who likes to fast and you're still in your fertile years, this is like the first 2 weeks is where you can kind of push it a little bit. Maybe you want to do like a 16-hour fast, something like that. So that would sort of be like the nutrition and fitness like action item there. Once we ovulate, which I will say is the point of your cycle, it's not to bleed. The bleed is the period, like she's like the popular girl in high school. She gets all the attention. We're always thinking about the blood, but the point of your cycle is to ovulate. That is the propagation of the like you need to release the egg, right? Whether or not you want a baby. That's not, your biology doesn't care about that. So we ovulate, and then the entire hormonal landscape changes. Now we see a drop off of estrogen, testosterone drops off as well. And then we see this introduction of progesterone. So this is progestation, progesterone, slower digestion. We tend to see, it causes you to warm up a little bit. So if you're somebody who's measuring your basal body temperature, you'll start to see your temperature rising. Cravings, sleep disturbances. These are some of the things that can happen under the influence of progesterone. She also chills you out a little bit. So she activates through a series of steps, a inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, which helps sort of calm you down and chill you out a little bit, which is why a lot of women in perimenopause feel riddled with anxiety. It's the testosterone and the deficiency of testosterone and the deficiency of progesterone. In terms of what we can think about this week, Again, still lifting weights, but now we can, instead of pushing it to like 5 reps as heavy as you can go, maybe it's like 10 reps or 12 reps as heavy as you can go. Again, profiting off of what we were talking about before, like releasing the myokines, bringing down that inflammation if she's feeling that. And then in week 4, if you are going to experience any PMS, this is where you're going to, this is the week where you are going to, Simona's going to get annoyed at you. My husband, I'm going to get annoyed at his breathing. I'm like, why are you breathing so loud? I don't know. Every 4 weeks, I can't, you just chew really loudly every 4 weeks. I don't know why.
Can I just jump in here quickly? Because Gio, her husband, is sitting behind the cameras right now and he's nodding and grinning.
He's like, oh yeah, I know that when I chew, I have to chew very quietly in week 4.
I feel your pain, mate.
So this is where you might, again, drop the weight again, but you have a higher rep set. So like I said before, the literature is very clear, 5 to 30 reps, you'll build muscle in that rep range, but maybe it's a 20 to 25 rep set, But of course, in order to do that, the weight needs to be a little bit lighter. So those are some of the things that I would think about over the, that's sort of like a back of the envelope, sort of what happens over the 4 weeks. When we move into perimenopause, a couple of things start to happen. One of the earliest signs, even before it's like clinically salient, if we are taking blood from, if we're, doing blood draws and watching her labs, we're going to start to see progesterone start to drop. That happens at about, unfortunately, age 35. So in age, this is why you'll see a lot of women say, or a lot of, doctors will say perimenopause starts around 35. You may not feel it yet, but now we're starting to see this declining level of progesterone. So some of the things that you might notice, your sleep is not, you're waking up, somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning is the most common thing that I hear, because you're not able to, and that might be a stress response, which we see sort of an inappropriate cortisol spike. We do see a cortisol awakening response, and that's normal, but it's not able to be balanced by an appropriate amount of progesterone. We might see her levels of anxiety, or if she does experience PMS, that will be amplified and exaggerated in that luteal phase. So she's going to start to notice, God, my PMS, I have raging PMS now, and I never really used to deal with that, and it's getting worse. The other clinically salient thing that we'll see for a woman in early perimenopause is that we might start to see her cycle length contract a little bit. So we've been talking about this 4-week cycle, but most women are not exactly 28 days. Maybe it's somewhere between 26 and 34 days is what we consider normal. So let's just say her cycle is 29 days typically. In her early 40s, she might say, oh, I've lost a day. I'm like a 28-day girl or a 27-day girl, right? So we start to see the cycle start to contract. You're smiling, you're nodding with knowing eyes. So we start to see this contraction of the cycle. Even though she's still ovulating, all the hormones, it's just happening in a more condensed time frame. That's sort of early perimenopause. Late perimenopause, we actually see an expansion of the cycle length. So now maybe she's gotten down to 24 days or something, and then she misses a month, right? And so she doesn't ovulate, she doesn't bleed that month, and then she gets her period the next month, right? So we start to see this expansion. So first it's a contraction, and then it's an expansion of the cycle. And that can go on for several years. A lot of women, this may start in their late 40s, early 50s. The average age to qualify for the diagnosis of menopause is 12 consecutive months without a period. It's just one day in your life, but that's how you can qualify to be menopausal. But that start and stop where you're like, okay, I got my period. Okay, no, I haven't got it for 3 months. Is this it? Am I in menopause? And then you get your period again, and then you don't get it again for 6 months. And you're sort of in this waiting room. It's like the perimenopausal waiting room for you to sort of qualify for this diagnosis.
Sounds super confusing.
It is.
How's anyone supposed to navigate this without people like you explaining what they should be going through? It's a bit confusing when you've spent nearly 30 years of your life having it like clockwork.
Yeah. I think the first thing is to understand that it's a normal process. So if you are someone who's kind of in this, where you're like, am I not? I'm not sure. It's like, I'm trying to get in. I'm trying to, I remember when I was young, we used to play double dutch with skipping ropes. It's like, do I jump in now? What about now? That sort of, it might feel a little bit like that. A perimenopausal woman, I will say again, as a clinician, typically difficult to care for, right? Because she's changing all the time. Like every month she's very different. It's actually much easier to treat a menopausal woman than it is a perimenopausal woman because she's in this state of flux. So often women in perimenopause, when they do finally get the courage to go to their primary healthcare provider, and they might explain to them or express to them, you know, I'm feeling more anxious, feeling more depressed, I don't feel like myself. Unfortunately, more often than not, they get a script for an antidepressant, right? I mean, that's often what happens. Or if we start to see, the other thing we'll see clinically, and I've seen this as well, so something for your listeners to know, is that their cholesterol levels start to get a little wonky. But what we typically see is the total cholesterol starts to creep, and then LDL starts to creep, LDLP, so the LDL particle number starts to go up, and then the other one is triglycerides. So you might not see LDLP if your doctor is not testing for it, but they will see total cholesterol and triglycerides elevated. And then what do you think that they give? What do you think? They'll be like, would you like a statin for that? You know, so then they walk out with like a, you know, birth control pill or antidepressant or statin, which I have thoughts on, as you might infer.
Yeah.
I don't know that that is the best intervention for these women. I think that they're...
I would say it slightly differently to that, but therefore...
God, yeah, it's so frustrating because so many women are like, I will say it's so hard for a woman to ask for help, like for a woman to go to her doctor and say, I'm really struggling. Like it's really, and to be a woman who's 40, in her 40s, early or late into her 40s, you know, you have all these other things that you're dealing with, aging parents that now need more love and attention and care, and you're dealing with the grief of, you know, their mortality, and your kids are teenagers maybe if you've decided to have children, and seeing them grow up, and, you know, at least I can say personally, you know, and you know, very candidly with you, Tim, because I know you and I love you and I trust you. It's very difficult for a mother, and I can say this from my own experience, having like my little schmoopies, like my little babies that I breastfed, and they were, you know, totally dependent on me for absolutely everything. And they don't really need me anymore. You know, like they make their own breakfast, they, you know, want to hang out with their friends, and it's I might even cry a little bit, but these tissues are here. But there's a little bit of grieving that has to happen in terms of our roles as mothers that happen in our 40s that I don't think anybody really talks about. We are seduced and romanticized with motherhood, which is by far the best thing I've ever done. It doesn't matter how many people know who I am, how many people buy my book, how many people listen to it. The best thing I've ever done is have my children. And it's very difficult to change. Oh my God, I'm going to cry. It's very difficult to change or to see your role changing as now they are becoming more independent. And nobody talks about this, and it happens like all at once in perimenopause. And then you have the hormonal changes that we've been talking about, the physiological changes. I haven't mentioned this, but I'll mention it now. Our body fat, our proclivity for the type of body fat also changes. So we now not only put on subcutaneous fat, but we also have more, because of these declining estrogen levels, we now want to put on more visceral fat, which I'm sure you know is like, that's the stuff that kills you. It's not the wiggly bits at the bottom of your thighs, right? In an estrogen dominant environment, in a sex dependent way, women will distribute fat sort of like the lower half of the body, right? Like the lower tummy, bum, hips, thighs. But as we lose estrogen, we actually deposit fat in a more, call it male way, which is what we would call like central adiposity or an ectopic fat distribution. So now we start to put on fat, we start to pack fat on centrally. And that's the stuff that kills you. So there's like all of these different tentacles that happen in perimenopause. And my wish for anyone that's listening to this, and this is sort of my philosophy as a doctor, is any good coach worth their salt, any good doctor worth their salt can predict your future for you so that when you get there, you don't misinterpret your experience. So when you're there and your teenagers are rolling their eyes at everything that you say, and your father slips and falls, and you think now he's had a stroke, and maybe now you need to relocate him to a home, and you're dealing with your own body composition changes and your own, you know, environmental, emotional, internal environment, that you don't think that you're broken. You're not broken, right? These women in their 40s, it's a very unique time for all of these things to sort of come to a head. And so my hope is that I can predict your future for you and give you some of the strategies that we've been talking about so that when it happens, you don't misinterpret it and think that there's something wrong with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Two things I just want to quickly add on this. It was like, don't take investment advice from a homeless person.
Right.
Springs to mind. Now, for instance, I've shared content about, why not to wear a bra, or which type of bra to wear, or, various female topics, because my audience is predominantly female, but I speak to experts about it, and I've been told you should not speak about this because you haven't got a vagina or whatever. And it's like, well, actually I consult with experts for this content. And
I consult with vaginas. Yeah. They're telling me what I'm telling you.
Is your gynecologist male or female? And quite often it's a male, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he understands fully. But the other thing I just want to add is it's really what really resonated with me in this is you were saying about how, your boys are growing up and they no longer need mum in the same way. In the same way. FYI, because I do have a mum and I am a boy, so I understand this journey from the other side. But one of the things that really resonated with me is like, I've had quite a few friends that have had kids, in the last 5-10 years. And I was like, how is this for you? Because they said, well, actually it's quite difficult because the relationship was them too. And then there's a third thing that actually is part of the mum. And then the relationship with the dad changes. And then he has to refine himself in the relationship and almost feels like a third wheel. And so it becomes less needed in an area because the focus goes to the children. It's like, and I've thought about this, how that must feel. So the nearest I can relate to that is you getting older and your kids getting older and not needing so much and your role changes slightly is very interesting thought. I hadn't considered that before. But from the flip side of it, from the boy with an amazing mum, who I'm very, very grateful for, it's like we will always need our mum because we understand the feminine from our mum. Right. It's just we just don't show or don't know how to show it until a later period. So it's very interesting to hear you say that about. And how old are your boys now? My boys are 14 and just turned 12. Yeah, good luck with that. Yeah. The best time. The terrific teenagers. Yeah. Oh my goodness. My 12 through to 18 was poor mum. We're just like white knuckling right now. It's like, I hope I've taught him. I hope I've infused my values and my beliefs and my, and I hope that he's been influenced by, their father, who I have a very wonderful relationship, and, their stepfather, my husband now. So I think that they're very lucky and very blessed to have those male influences. And I just gotta hope and pray that my teachings are somewhere in there. There's a moral compass somewhere in there. Yeah. Amazing. So finally, if you had one bit of advice to give to women around their fitness or nutrition plans or anything at all to do with this, what would it be? I have two things. One I already mentioned early in our conversation, which was just start. Like, just do something, do anything. Like, just get on the road. The other piece, which I think is a bit of an unlearning, and I was alluding to it a little bit before, which is you're not broken. Yes, we are changing. The brain is restructuring. The hormones are changing. And your body has a default to want to express abundance and health. Our body's default, that homeostatic desire to express health, is always within you, right? And through some of the tools that we've been talking about today, through the nutrition, through the fitness, through the stress management, our relationship with ourselves in context to our relationship with others, we can express that health, right? Dr. Stephanie Estima, thank you very much for coming on. Thank you. It's been just wonderful. Thank you for having me. A massive thank you to my guest, Dr. Stephanie Estima. Learn more about her female-specific health strategies over at drstephanieestima.com. You've been listening to the Health Optimization Podcast, and I'm Tim Gray. Comment and leave the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to my channel to see more. See you next time, and remember, let's spread the health.